Well, last night, Canon announced their latest camera, and that's the R8. And do I think it's going to be a decent wildlife camera for photo and video? And am I considering picking one up? Well, let's talk about it. When the rumor sites first started talking about the Canon R8, I didn't really know where that camera fit in the lineup, and between the 7 and the R10, where would it sit? And a lot of other people I saw in videos or talked to, they didn't really understand where that camera fit anywhere from the rumor sites, the specs they had. And even those specs were a bit off. I think several places talked about it wouldn't have an EVF or may have an add-in EVF, and would have a different type of articulating screen and some other things. And of course, those didn't come to fruition, and that's kind of why I don't discuss these cameras until Canon, Nikon, Sony, whoever says, here is the actual camera and here is the actual specs, and they've given it to a few of the pre-production models of people to look at. But last night, as they started releasing this camera, I started watching a lot of the videos, the camera actually started to make sense. And what this camera is to me, it's actually a replacement for the RP and the R, because those cameras are gone, and it sits right in that range, and it kind of makes a lot more sense. And in my opinion, they did more than that in what they delivered, and from what I saw in the reviews, it really surprised me. So in the most simplistic terms, what is the Canon R8? Well, the Canon R8 is actually the R6 Mark II in a smaller body format. And it's actually the same ergonomics and size in the body as the Canon RP. It only has a few small differences from the R6 Mark II, really, and it's really due to that smaller body format. And I was looking through those reviews and digging around, and I was really looking for that cripple hammer that Canon's famous for. I didn't really find any. There's not a whole lot of cripple hammer in this camera, and that really shocked me for Canon. I also want to say, if you watch the Canon R6 Mark II video, you'll know that I really liked that camera from the photos and the video that put out, and the autofocus was just amazing. With all that being said, let's run through the R8 in regards to what it is for wildlife photography, and let's determine if I think it's going to be a good camera from what the camera has in it and what it can do from a photo and video perspective. So let's talk about the button layout and the ergonomics of this camera. For the ergonomics, I don't really know until I pick it up and hold it. It is a lot smaller body because it's in that RP format. As far as the button layout, if you look from the top, it looks exactly like the R6 Mark II, which I like because it's got the two dials on top, which one is, like how I said it, would be shutter on one and the ISO on the other. On the back of the camera is where it changed. It doesn't have a dial like the R6 Mark II. It has a D-pad down there besides that, and it doesn't have a joystick. Do those hinder me for wildlife photography? No. I'm used to the D-pad on the R7. I actually like the D-pad on the R7. Yes, the dial, when I was on the R5, it was kind of cool to have to spin around, but I've gotten really used to that D-pad on the R7 when I'm deleting pictures or going through menu settings or just touching the back of the screen. As far as the joystick, am I going to miss that if I had this camera? No. The joystick actually gets in my way half the time. The only time I really hit my joystick is if I need to recenter my single point because I bumped that joystick and that single point's moved off into one of the corners and I need to get it back to the middle when I need it. Because what I use the single point for is to get to a point, and I just pick the center of the camera up and get to that spot and then recompose. That's the way I work anyway. The only other thing that changed on the back of that camera is the rate button's gone. Never used it before myself. I don't use it. And the Q button's not up by the info button. It is now down to the center of the D-pad, just like it is on the R7. So again, those two button changes don't really affect me for wildlife photography. It still work great. As far as all the extra camera setting features that are in this camera, kind of like the raw burst mode, the focus stacking, the bracketing, all that stuff, it's in this just like the R6 Mark II. So pretty much all the guts that were in the R6 Mark II, for the most part, other than these three little spots I'll tell you that changed, are exactly the same as the R6 Mark II. I didn't expect that to happen in this camera, so that's really amazing. So you get all those same features you see in the R6 Mark II. So you can watch any R6 Mark II video on setups and features, and you're going to get the exact same thing you need for this R8. So again, no cripple hammer right there. Just amazing, or just shocking, I guess I should say, from Canon anyway. So now about the sensor that's in the camera. Again, like I said, it's all the guts from the R6 Mark II. It has the same exact sensor that's in the R6 Mark II, the 24.2 megapixel sensor. That has an amazing readout speed that's even faster than the R5. And it doesn't really have any rolling shutter. And the only cameras that will be better than this right now are anything that has a backside illuminated sensor that we're talking getting up that $3,500 range or higher, as far as I know, as far as cameras. So basically everything we know about the R6 Mark II sensor is in this R8, and that's a bit crazy because I was really expecting a lower line sensor, kind of like we got in the R10 from the R7. You know, we were hoping maybe the sensor's the same, but other stuff is dumbed down, but the sensor was dumbed down. But to have that same sensor that's an R6 Mark II in the R8 at $1,000 difference, that's pretty major from Canon, from my past experience with Canon, because they usually put some type of cripple in there, and the sensor's where they usually get you. And they didn't this time. It's pretty neat. So let's talk about drive modes and frames per second. So this, we did have a little bit of change here. We don't have a mechanical shutter in the R8. You also know that the only other camera right now that I know of that doesn't do that is the Nikon Z9, which I do own, and it does have a mechanical shutter. I don't miss it. They're loud, they're clunky, they're slower most part. So the only thing this camera has is first curtain electronic and full electronic. In first curtain, you only get 6 frames a second, which is fine. What it looks like even like the R7, the R10, that first curtain is pretty loud, and it sounded like when the guys were reviewing this, that first curtain is pretty loud. I personally always shoot electronic if I can. The only time I didn't with the R5 and use first curtain there was because I had no sound on the electronic shutter, and I didn't know how many pictures I was taking. Once the R7 and the R3, those came out, and the R10, you can hear that. So with those cameras, yes, I use the electronic shutter fully. And with this camera, like we talked before about the sensor, you're not getting really any rolling shutter. So running 40 frames a second electronic is fine. Of course, the buffer speed is a problem. We'll talk a little bit why that's a problem and something about the SD card here in a second. But like I'm saying, 40 frames a second, fantastic, just like the R6 Mark II. If you have no problem shooting that R6 Mark II, you're not going to have any problems shooting that on the R8, from at least what I can gather. And really, for me, that suits my style of shooting. All right, well, now let's talk about video. So again, it's just like the R6 Mark II as far as video. But there's one thing about this camera that's different than all the other cameras in its price range. The R6 Mark II and some of these other $2,500 and more cameras will shoot 4K 60 uncropped. This is the only camera that I know of that's below $2,500 that will shoot 4K 60 in uncropped format. So that is fantastic, especially at that $1,500 mark. So for video, I don't know of another camera that will do what this camera does. It'll do 4K up to 4K 60. It'll do 1080p at 180 frames a second. Again, that's phenomenal too. It makes it even more better slow-mo. So a little bit about the timers on this. That is a little difference in this camera. I guess maybe you could call that a cripple hammer, but it's not a really big one. So anything at 4K 60 is going to be a 30-minute timer along with the 1080p at 180 frames a second. But if you're shooting 4K 30, 24, 25, one of those, you have a 2-hour limit, which is great because by the time you hit that 2 hour, you probably ran out of battery, ran out of card at that time. And so that's nice because at the 4K 30 and 1080p at 180, you're probably not shooting 30 minutes anyway. The only time you're going to be shooting over 30 minutes is when you're in 4K 30, 4K 24, when you're doing the things like I'm doing here, the talking head stuff, where you need that longer time to keep talking. So as far as the autofocus in the camera, again, like I said before, same guts, same working, same settings, same Digitex processor, same sensor as the R6 Mark II. And from what I can gather from the multi pre-production views, that camera is exactly the same. And it has the best autofocus that Canon's put out so far, along with the Canon R8. Another difference in this camera is the battery this camera uses an LP17 battery, which is about half the battery life of the NH battery that the R5, 6, 7, the 6 Mark II use right now. And the cons of that is it's not going to last as long, and when you're in the studio like I am trying to record talking heads, or you're doing interviews, or you're doing longer recordings, you're going to need some type of external battery source or extra batteries to change those out. And if you're out in the field running around, I would suggest you have at least 3 batteries on hand, one on the camera and 2 extra ones to replace them with, because they could run out pretty quick if you're having a hot and heavy shoot or running the camera the whole time. Now, why do they use a smaller battery in that camera versus using a larger battery, besides trying to bring the price down and things like that? Well, it's because they have that smaller body size, and the bigger NH battery is not going to fit inside that camera and have all the other internals that it is. So that's why they had to use a smaller battery in this camera. At least this is what I think. One of the last of the big changes and differences in this camera, and if you want to call them the cons or the cripple hammer, was it doesn't have dual card slot. It only has a single card slot. I personally don't shoot redundant. I probably should, but I don't. I always have just one card in the camera and one in my pocket or one in the vehicle to go back and grab if I'm close to the vehicle. So to me, that's not a big hindrance, but for some people, you know, if you're shooting dual redundant, you know, you want to shoot dual redundant all the time, then that's going to be a bit of a problem for you. For me, it's not an issue to only have one card in the camera. Another thing, this camera, it does, just like the R10, it doesn't have a door cover that comes over the sensor when the camera closes, so it's something you need to be careful with, and make sure you change that lens real quick, or when you take it off, make sure it's facing down so no dust and dirt's going to fall in on your sensor. Never had a problem when I had the R10 with that issue, but it is something to be aware of and know that it doesn't have a sensor cover. So the last big difference on this camera that a lot of people were back over the fence, back and forth about it, was no IBIS in the body. To me, that's not that big an issue, and I think I talked about this a little bit with the R10 video. Just as a few years ago, besides having the 1D series, 1DX series, we didn't have IBIS in the body on any camera for Canon. Your 7Ds, your 6Ds, Mark IIs, your 5D Mark IVs, all those cameras, none of those had IBIS in the body. What we did have, and we still do for wildlife photographers, is almost all of our lenses we use, even the third parties, the 1-500, 600 Tamron and Sigmas, they have VR or IS in their lens, actually VR maybe Nikon, and the 1-400, the RF 1-400, all those lenses, 7200, all those lenses, 1-500, they all have IS in the lens. So there you go. You have image stabilization, you know, 3 to 5 stops on most of them. The only lenses you may not have image stabilization on is if you have a really old lens like a 300 f4, 300 2.8 that's about 18, 20 years old, or a 400 5.6, that lens, they don't have IS in them. So you got those lenses, you have to up your shutter speed. So the second part of not having the IBIS and you only have IS in your lens, if you're still getting motion blur because you shake a lot or you're whip panning, then just increase your shutter speed to compensate for that. Because that's what we did in the past when we didn't have IBIS in the body. And I never had a problem with that personally, not having IBIS in the body. And to be honest with you, sometimes I turn all the image stabilization off when I'm on a tripod. Because if everything's extremely still, sometimes the cameras with the IS is trying to compensate and you can get wobble and warp in your camera or your pictures. And that's what landscape photographers always turn the IS off on their lenses in their body when they're shooting landscape on a tripod, because that will happen and they'll get a little bit of blur somewhere in the picture. So again, long story short, too late, I know. To me, not having the IBIS at the price point this camera comes in at $1,500, I could live without it. I mean, personally, if I was buying the camera. Okay, with all the specs laid out on this camera and the difference between the R6 Mark II and the R8, and I'll list those real quick for you again. No IBIS, single card slot, and no joystick or dial in the back of the camera, which all three of those that I talked about, to me, don't hinder me for wildlife photography. They're things that don't bother me, and they don't stop me from taking the picture and getting the good picture. Do I think it's going to be a good camera for photography and videography for us wildlife photographers in that aspect? And photography, yes, I believe yes. With the caveat of you're wanting a full frame camera instead of a crop sensor like the R7, and 24 megapixels is not bad for you as far as you don't need to recrop or crop really tight into the image, or the subjects are real small in the picture, things like that, then yes, for photography, great camera, because you got a phenomenal autofocus, phenomenal image quality, and extremely fast readout speed, so almost no rolling shutter at 40 frames a second. So for videography, yeah, it's a no-brainer. If you're a videographer, this camera is going to be great to pick up. There's no other camera under like $2,500 that will shoot 4K on crop 60 frames a second or 180 frames a second at 1080p. And the quality of that video is fantastic, and the autofocus is drop dead. You can't beat it for video. It's going to stay on you the whole time. Now for me, am I picking one up? As you know, I didn't pick up the R6 Mark II. That's pretty much what this camera is, at a lower price tag and a few little small adjustments that, again, like I said before, don't affect me for wildlife photography. And the simple answer is, yeah, I've already gone down to Stewart's. I've got my name on the list. As soon as it comes in, I will have it, and we'll do a full review then. And why? Well, it has all the same features as the R6 Mark II, of course, excluding the small little things like no sensor door when you turn the camera off, not a big deal. Single SD card slot, not a big deal. No joystick, that's fine. That thing gets in my way more than it's helpful. And a smaller battery, which that one's a little bit of a headache, but I can buy extra batteries and plug it into the studio. And none of those things are a deterrent to me at the price point that this camera comes in at $1,500. Just like I said about the Canon R7, you know, with the the negatives on that camera, the rolling shutter, button placement, things like that. At $1,500, it was worth it. And I say the same about this camera. At $1,500, all the negatives or even the 24 megapixels, which I'll talk about here in a minute, those weren't enough deterrent to me not to pick this camera up at $1,500. And it's because of what my shooting needs are, that's why I picked it up. And what are those shooting needs for this camera? And everybody has different shooting needs, right? The first one for me is what I'm doing right here is a studio camera. So I'm shooting right now on the Canon R7 with the 14-35 RF, which I love that lens. And it's a good price point, at least for an L lens. It's fantastic. But this camera, the R7, is also, if you watch the Eagle video, this is my primary videography camera in the field if I'm not using it for extra reach like I did in the Merlin video where I needed that crop sensor to get out farther. And I have that camera set up for most of the time I'm running around with this R7 sitting with animal detect at 1080p at 120 frames a second. So when I bring it in the studio, I got to pull all the lenses off, put the studio lens on at the 14-35. Then I have to go in the settings and change all the settings. I either have a hot set or I have to do it manually where I've got to set it to 4K 24 and people instead of animals. So that would kind of a pain in the butt. It takes 15 to 20 minutes to get all that swapped out and set up with, especially with the Atomos, so I can see myself as I'm talking here and things like that. So that's the first thing I need it for. The second thing I need it for, just like I talked about when I picked up the R10, was I needed that third camera. So what happened with the R7 when I lost that for a few weeks, I was down to one camera, the R5. And it really was a pain in the butt right then because I either need to do studio work or I've got to have stills and video when I'm out in the field. And having the two cameras keeps me moving the whole time. I don't have to keep swapping out lenses and settings and stuff. One camera set up for one thing, one camera set up for the other one, and keep moving. So if something like that does happen again, I would have the R8 to take it out in the field to use. So that was the second reason. And also for vacation, I could take the R8 out to my vacations, not worry about it. It's going to be full frame to get wide angle stuff and other things if I'm out running around. So this camera should also hold up out in the field because it's not as good as the R5, but it still should have pretty good weather sealing to take it out in light weather, not major weather. So with all that said, as soon as I get the camera, we'll do a full review of this camera like I always do, ISO performance, how well it performs to autofocus, things like that. But if this camera holds up like all the reviewers said, it's just like the R6 Mark II, which I've already used, I think it's going to be a fantastic camera, especially at $1,500. And like always, guys, like, share, subscribe. Thanks for listening to me ramble about my thoughts on the R8 and why I picked the camera up. And I'm really excited to get that camera in and start using it. And in the meantime, you guys stay safe and go run that shutter.